Thank you guys for coming. My name is Rumya. I am the program manager for the Citizen Science program for the Key Biscayne Community Foundation. Normally, I'm here presenting a speaker. Today, I am going to be the speaker. And my background is in marine biology kind of generally. I do have a Bachelor of Arts in sculpture. That was a very long time ago. And I did a complete 180 and went into science and got a bachelor's in biological science, followed by a master's in fisheries management and conservation, and a second master's in ecosystem science and policy. Within marine biology, even though most of what I do dealt with ecosystem science and fish and physiology, things like that, there is a lot of things that involve climate change when you're learning about these things. Climate change affects the ocean very heavily. And so you have to kind of understand how a lot of these things work in order to do this kind of research. And so a lot of what I was doing was very heavily informed by what's going on with climate change. Today I'm going to talk to you about climate change and how it affects small island nations. I will, throughout the presentation, try to relate that back to Key Biscayne. Most of us know what kind of issues we're facing anyway, but and for us, we're lucky because we aren't a separate nation. We are part of one of the wealthiest nations in the world. But then when you're looking at a country like Haiti or Grenada or whatever, you know, like these little tiny islands that are just completely self-sufficient, when they're feeling these effects of climate change, they're much more devastated by them. First, I'm going to go over ocean-related issues caused by climate change. And then I'm just going to talk a little bit about fisheries vulnerability and relate why that's important when we talk about the small island nations and how they're affected. I might go a little bit fast. If I do, just raise your hand and tell me. I just want to make sure I get through everything before 8 o'clock, and I don't want to keep you guys here for too long. But I tend to be long-winded, so feel free to interrupt me and tell me. So before we get into it, I just want to show you this graph that I have that shows the measured carbon content of the atmosphere. This goes up to 2014, so it's not exactly recent, but what's interesting about this is that it goes back hundreds of thousands of years. And so it shows you how the carbon content of the atmosphere has changed over time. And that's measured in a lot of different ways. Ice cores in particular from the North and South poles can go back hundreds of thousands of years, and they can check the bubbles in the layers to see how much carbon or oxygen or whatever was in the atmosphere so many years ago. There's also different ways of checking the geologic record to see, you know, what's changed in the atmosphere. And the people that do that are called geochronologists. It's a really interesting and confusing science. They can get some pretty accurate records from that. So this is showing from 1979. These are measured records that we've been keeping track of and measuring specifically from 1979 up, and like I said, this goes up to 2014. But then once it gets to 2014, to show you, what it's doing is showing the, as I mentioned, the atmospheric carbon dioxide content. So these are all the measurements that have been taken. And as you can see, it's just steadily increasing from 79 onwards. This will go up to 2014, and then it'll start backtracking and showing you past measurements that have been taken from ice cores and geologic record, things like that. About 1960 to 2014. And now if you watch the bottom, we're at 1,200, 1,000, 800. So KY is kiloyears, which means thousands of years. So 40 kiloyears is 40,000 years, 80,000 years. So ice ages tend to last in the 100,000 year range. And then the interglacial periods are shorter. They're usually 10 to 20, maybe 30,000 years. The last ice age was approximately, I think, around 20,000 years ago. I don't know exactly. But that's why, you know, we were actually supposed to be entering another ice age. And if you look at the records from, you know, as they've been measured or as we've been able to ascertain, the temperature was very slowly, very, very slowly dropping. And then around the Industrial Revolution and shortly after, with the carbon dioxide content increasing, it started going back up. You can see the carbon content is like, you know, it does fluctuate quite a bit, but it never gets over about 300, and what we're at the very end there is close to 400, and we actually have passed 400 at this point since 2014, and that's parts per million in the atmosphere. Talking about the issues that are related to climate change that happen in the ocean, and then we'll talk about how these affect small island nations. First is ocean acidification. Now, I have these chemical formulas. They're the only chemical formulas I'm going to show you. These are very simple ones too, and it's just basically how carbon dioxide in the atmosphere affects the acidification of the ocean. So basically you have carbon dioxide gas mixing with the water in the ocean, and that creates carbonic acid, and that reduces the pH of the ocean. So regular water with nothing in it is a pH 7, completely neutral. 7 is considered neutral. If you go below 7, then it's acidic, and if you go above 7, then it's alkaline or basic. So the ocean already is slightly basic. It's usually around 8.1 now. It used to actually be slightly higher than that, like 8.2, 8.3. But it's 8.1 now. And that's because it has a lot of minerals besides, like in that salt, there's magnesium and calcium and all kinds of other things, and that makes it slightly basic. So when we're talking about acidification, it's not turning into an acid specifically, it's just becoming more acidic. It's heading towards the acidic side of the pH scale. And while a change from 8.1 to 7.7 seems like a very small change, this is on a logarithmic scale. So it's actually an exponential change that's happening. So that is actually a very large jump. The pH scale only goes up to 12.
It's supposed to decrease?
Yeah, so right now it's expected to decrease by the end of the century, so 2100 or so, to 7.7. So it's a slow decrease, but it's enough that it's already having an effect. And then the second equation I have up there shows calcium carbonate, which is one of the things that you find in the ocean in quite a bit of abundance. When that mixes with carbonic acid, it breaks it up into bicarbonate and calcium ions. Now that's important because it affects the things that live in the ocean. Now, that's a really obnoxious title. I did that on purpose. This is my paper. I was trying to be smart. So what this is we were checking the toxicity of pharmaceuticals on like freshwater bugs, essentially, like poisoning them with pharmaceuticals to see what they could take. But the important part of this, it says pH-dependent toxicity. And what that means is that we were testing them with pharmaceuticals, but we were testing them at various pH levels. So first we were checking what pH can they live in. And remember, these are freshwater animals. So what we found is they could live in any pH that was very acidic from 4, pH of 4. Coke is like 3. Your stomach acid is 2. So pH of 4 is very acidic. But they could live in a pH of 4 all the way up to 11, which is very, very alkaline. Most things can't do that. But freshwater systems are used to very huge swings in pH because they get all kinds of like different minerals and chemicals flushed in from rainwater or from mountain streams, or so they tend to be very dynamic systems. Whereas the ocean, being so huge, tends to be very stable. So the ocean, the animals that live within the ocean are not evolved to deal with those kinds of crazy swings in pH. So these guys all lived in pH 4 to 11. So these are freshwater hydra, which are related to sea anemones. They're very similar, but they're really, really tiny. Ostracods, Daphnia, they're just a freshwater bug. Any pond water, if you take a cup of it, you'll find these guys. And then mosquito larvae, because of course mosquitoes can live in everything. They're like cockroaches. But yeah, what we found is that, aside from the effects the pharmaceuticals were having, they were able to live relatively fine in a pH range from 4 to 11, which is a huge range. And actually the mosquitoes could go down to 2. So that's important because in the loss of calcium carbonate in a freshwater system is not as devastating because they are used to that kind of swing. They're not dependent on it. However, in the ocean, calcium carbonate is a very important substance. Brain corals, or really any corals, the skeleton, that white skeleton that they build underneath them, is made of calcium carbonate. I could have picked a better picture of a snail or something, but a flamingo tongue underneath the brightly colored skin is its shell. The shells that you pick up on the beach are predominantly calcium carbonate. And then crustaceans like lobster, shrimp, crabs, things like that, their outside carapace isn't made from calcium carbonate, but it's a very important component during their development. If they don't get enough of it, the way that they grow is that they shed their outside skin, and then they have a very kind of soft like skin underneath, and they'll go and hide until it hardens. and it hardens slightly bigger than the previous one, and that's how they grow. So they shed their entire skin. When they aren't developing properly because they aren't getting the proper calcium carbonate or other nutrients, they have trouble shedding their skin, and they'll suffocate and die because they can't get it off. Or they just won't develop in other ways, and they end up not being able to survive. So there's a lot of different animals, and there's more than this even, but there are a lot of different marine animals that are dependent on calcium carbonate. And so when you have ocean acidification that's making it harder for the calcium carbonate to form because it's breaking it apart into its relative ions, then it causes problems for all of these guys. Next, we're going to talk about ocean warming and sea surface temperature, changes in sea surface temperature. So this is just a quick graph to show you the changes between 1880, around the Industrial Revolution, to 2020, so fairly recently. And this is the change that has been observed and measured in the sea surface temperatures around the world. So there's 3 different measurements there, and they're from 3 different areas around the world. And that they're just using as a base the average between 1970 and 2000. That's probably actually a little bit of a high average. If we go back before the Industrial Revolution, it's probably going to be lower than that. But even still, for that average, which is somewhat recent, it's already above that. And these are average temperatures that are just sort of continuing like this. This is just a graph to show you what the temperatures kind of look like ordinarily. So obviously around the equator in the middle, it's much warmer, and it gets cooler as you go towards the poles. What we find is that when the sea surface temperatures are increasing, obviously they're going to increase faster around the equator because that's where it's getting more direct sunlight and it's taking in more heat. But it doesn't necessarily heat up evenly. So land doesn't take in heat as well as water does. Water can take in quite a lot of heat without changing temperature too much, whereas land heats up very quickly and then it can't take in any more heat. So what you have here, what ends up happening, down here in the southern hemisphere, the water is heating up. It's doing so very slowly because there's a lot of water here to take it in. In the northern hemisphere, there's a lot less water because there's a lot more land mass. So what happens up here is that this land can only take in a little bit of heat, and then there's a lot left over, so it's kind of forced into the water because that's what's going to take it in to keep the temperature of Earth stable. The oceans are one of the things that keep our temperature stable, especially as the atmosphere continues to have increased carbon dioxide. So the northern hemisphere is actually heating up, the ocean is heating up faster than the southern hemisphere because it has to, so the entire Earth gets the same amount of light from north to south, or same amount of solar radiation, but the ocean here has to take in more of that radiation because of the amount of land there, whereas the southern hemisphere has a lot more water to spread it out more, essentially. When you look at land and ocean together, one thing I want to point out, when you look at where the ocean sea surface temperatures are, they're about close to 1 degree Fahrenheit higher than the average that they're using here. When you look at land and ocean together, and this again goes up to 2020, these are the changes in temperatures that have been, from that this is actually a different average, 1901 to 2000. That's probably a more accurate average. But when you're looking at that average and where the temperatures have been, you notice that they are kind of low, below the average. And then they start going up around 1940 or so, and then they continue to increase. And when you're looking at land and ocean together, you're looking at this point, about a 1.5 degree Fahrenheit increase, and it's on its way to 2 degree increase. And that's, global average, obviously. That's not any specific area. So some areas you're going to have a much bigger increase, and some areas little increase or maybe no increase. But on a global average, that's where it's at. So moving on to sea level rise and coastal flooding. This is something we're very familiar with here. It comes up all the time. Melting ice caps, of course, is one of the biggest things that people talk about when it comes to sea level rise. I put that in there to make everybody sad. Yeah. This graph here shows, or this picture here shows basically what the Earth would look like if 80% of the ice caps melted. And what it's showing is all of these red areas would be flooded if 80% of the ice caps melted. And this is just looking at the ice caps. So obviously, we're gone. The entire Amazon River basin is flooded. You know, all these areas that are relatively low-lying, even if they don't seem like it now. But there is some evaporation, but the atmosphere can only hold so much water also. So it can't just all evaporate into the atmosphere. It has to have some place to go, and there's only so much that can be held in the atmosphere. And that is a very insubstantial amount compared to the amount that's melting, just for the short answer. So thermal expansion. So when water's heated, it expands in volume. And when you're just heating up a cup of water in the microwave, that, you know, the expansion that happens is imperceptible because it's such a small amount of water. But when you're doing it on a global scale, when it's an ocean that is heating up, that thermal expansion is actually a very, very large contributor to sea level rise. At present, thermal expansion accounts for about 30% of sea level rise. And according to the 2014 IPCC report, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that is likely to increase to 70% of sea level rise will be caused by thermal expansion. And that's just because of the heat content that is being forced into the water because we keep heating. I want to say towards the end of the century or within the next 150 years, something like that. So not like immediately, but as it is, thermal expansion is already responsible for about 30% of sea level rise, which is not, you know, that's a third. It's quite a lot. Again, looking at ocean heat content, that's the main contributor, obviously, to thermal expansion, how much heat is being forced into the ocean. So these are 3 different areas around the world that are measuring ocean heat content. Obviously, NOAA is here in the States. MRI-GMA is in Japan. CSIRO is Australia. It stands for the Commonwealth of Scientific and Industrial Research Organization, I think. And then that is Japan Meteorological Association or Agency. And I forgot what MRI is, but they're the same thing. Because, again, when we were talking about the increase in global temperature, that's an average of the entire globe, but different areas are going to show different amounts. Yeah, exactly. So they're only measuring within their areas. And it makes sense. So the Pacific Ocean is much larger than the Atlantic Ocean, and so their heat content is more dissipated. So when you look at Japan, they don't have quite, I mean, they definitely have an increase, but it's not quite as much as the other two. Australia is just in a very strange place. Like Australia has all kinds of problems, but they obviously match very closely, and we're measuring, I believe, Atlantic Ocean here. But the heat content, again, is just above average. This is, again, that same 30-year average that they used before. These graphs come from NASA, most of them. But generally speaking, despite the slight discrepancies between, you know, the different measurements, they are showing a general trend of increasing ocean heat content. And so that is going to contribute to thermal expansion, among other problems that too much heat causes. And then, of course, all of this contributes to coastal flooding. Warm water feeds hurricanes. A lot of the strong hurricanes that we get is because they go over very warm areas of the ocean. This picture here is from 2015, and it was a Category 5 hurricane that hit the west coast of Mexico. And that hasn't happened there in a very, very long time, or it maybe never. I can't exactly remember, but it was a very, very strange phenomenon. And that year, 2015, the Pacific Ocean had 9 major hurricanes, which means Category 3 or above, and that's a record for the Pacific Ocean. That's never happened there before. The Atlantic hurricanes, our previous record was 2005, the most hurricanes and most named storms, and I believe it was 28 or 29, and then we beat it in 2020. We didn't have more hurricanes, although we did have quite a lot of hurricanes, but we had more named storms, and there were 30 of them. So we beat 2005 by just a few named storms, which means tropical storm or higher. And then 2021 came in right behind 2005. So that's 2, you know, pretty much record years right in a row. And this is what's expected as all of these changes happen. The ocean feeds the atmosphere feeds the ocean. And so all of these changes in the global climate are going to feed this kind of atmospheric behavior and weather patterns. So I have another short video for you guys. And this is every named storm in the 2020 Atlantic record year. So I think it'll say the name of the storm up here. So these are all satellite images from NASA. or from NOAA, sorry. And it's also just, looking at it, like seeing just how massive these storms are. It's kind of frightening and awe-inspiring, when it covers your entire state and the 3 surrounding states.
They're so well defined too, sometimes.
Yeah, those are usually the ones that turn into major hurricanes.
Yeah.
Will the Gulf of Mexico attract more because it's shallower and therefore may heat up more rapidly?
Yeah, so there's a lot of changes in sort of weather patterns and ridges, like pressure ridges, that have kind of been dictating where the hurricanes move. That's actually worked in our favor. They've been missing the majority of Florida recently. But they do tend to gain steam in the Gulf because the Gulf heats up because it's shallower. It heats up faster. And yeah, there have been a lot of hurricanes there recently that have become very strong. And then really strange ones like Hurricane Harvey that went up and just sat on top of, what was it, Houston for like a few days, went back out and then made a second landfall and did it again. And then there was Hurricane Dorian that sat on top of Grand Bahama Island and just ground it into dust for 5 days. And it was because of a pressure ridge that basically wouldn't let it move. So it's a lot of really weird behavior along with more and more hurricanes, more severe hurricanes, and a lot of really strange patterns with their movement and behavior. So quickly, I'm going to talk about fisheries vulnerability. And the reason is because this is very important with fisheries and their reaction to these changes in climate, but also how this affects small island nations. Because the majority of them are very dependent on their fisheries because they don't have land mass for farming and other types of other things to sort of supplement their GDP. So fisheries ends up being a huge part of their economy. So sorry, this is sort of a bad graphic, but this basically shows the direction where fish have already been shown to move, but are expected to move even more. And the reason for that is this area where, around the equator in the tropics is heating up very quickly. And you have a lot of fish that have evolved to live in that warm climate, but they can only live there to a certain extent at a certain temperature. If it gets too warm, it becomes dangerous for them to live there because they can't thermoregulate properly, or it affects their ability to do so. It may also affect the ability of them spawning. Their eggs are very fragile, and if the water's too warm, it could easily kill them. And so what a lot of migratory fish are starting to do is move north and move south where the water is still somewhat cooler. You also have other considerations of, well, I'll get into that in a minute, but also, ecosystems change because of the temperature changes also. But I'll talk about that in a minute. The way that this is measured, the vulnerability of a fishery or of a community that's dependent on the fishery, you look at risk exposure. So the risks that they're facing, temperature increases, increased storm activity, destruction of habitat, things like that. So that's a risk exposure that they're exposed to. How sensitive they are to these risks. So can they cope with, a mild temperature increase, but not like a severe temperature increase? How sensitive are they to that risk? And then you look at their adaptive capacity. So if they aren't too sensitive to it, then they are able to adapt to this change maybe a little bit better than the very sensitive fish. And then on top of that, one way of being adaptive is being able to migrate. So a lot of these, fish, and I'm saying just fish, but really I mean any kind of fishery. So that could be the lobster fishery or crab industry or sea cucumbers or whatever it is. Sea cucumbers don't really move. So if it heats up, they're just basically cooked. A lot of fish are migratory, so they can move, and that increases their adaptive capacity. It means they can move to a different area possibly and live there instead. It's not any good for the people that live in this area and are dependent on them being there, but for the fishery itself or for the fish species, that is a plus for their adaptive capacity. And so all of these are things, and then when you're looking at the same thing for communities that are dependent on these different fisheries, do they have the capacity to change their livelihoods to a different type of livelihood that's not so heavily dependent on the ocean or on something that's being affected by climate change? That kind of adaptive capacity is also very important. Now, when I was talking about habitat destruction, coral reefs are in particular danger when it comes to a lot of these issues that we've talked about. First of all, with sea level rise, coral reefs, obviously they don't move. They just grow in an area. They can grow in a direction, but it takes hundreds of years to really take up any space. The spores move all over the place, but a lot of them get eaten and a lot of them don't spawn even if they land somewhere, or they'll try and then fail. But they have to be able to live in that area. There has to be food there. It has to be the type of area that they are able to live within. So they spread everywhere. Most of the spores get eaten. And a lot of them land or end up in areas where they aren't able to attach, they aren't able to grow. So, that's why you end up with coral reefs just in like a certain area, but not like way over here, because, they might reach that area, but they can't live there. So it depends. There's a lot of factors that play into it. And in particular, the coral reefs that exist are already, thousands upon thousands of years old. And they have become, obviously, a lot of different animals have become very heavily dependent on them as their habitat. And, the corals are photosynthetic, most of them. And they live in the area known as the euphotic zone. And that is where light reaches so that they can photosynthesize. And, as they get pushed into deeper water because of sea level rise, the euphotic zone is going to change with that. And it's a very slow change, but again, these guys can't move. It's like trying to ask a tree to uproot itself and follow the light. It can't do that. So eventually, in certain areas, that can become too deep and they're not going to get enough light. They'll slowly die off. But the other bigger problem is rising temperatures. And that is something that happens very, very quickly, especially during El Nino years. You get these huge temperature increases in certain areas and massive coral bleaching. Coral bleaching doesn't necessarily kill the coral, but it will. Most corals can't recover from coral bleaching. Basically what it means is that they expel the algae that lives in their tissues, and so they're just completely white and clear tissue. They're not dead yet, but most of them will not recover from that. Probably 90 to 95% of corals, maybe even more, will die if they bleach. And then once they die, the coral skeleton underneath is no longer being maintained, and so it will also start to crumble. So then it's destroying the habitat where all these little fish will hide and the little shrimp will hide and live. And so that becomes a huge problem and is already becoming a huge problem. So these were pictures that I took when I was working for the Nature Conservancy. I was in Haiti doing work in this national park that they had designated. And we were talking to the people that lived and worked in the area. And basically what you see here is this guy's daily catch. It's mostly minnows. He has one kind of big fish. But this is the same size basket that he'd used his entire life, and he used to be able to fill that. And now, and it's not just climate change that's caused this. There's a lot of pollution and other problems, but all that does is just compound the problem. And so what you end up with are these people that this is their livelihood, and this is basically like what he's been able to catch to try to sell or to feed his family. This guy is, you can't tell, but he's holding a fish. And I included this. It's a bad picture. I got my camera wet, but I included this because he was like laughing about it. That was the only fish he had caught in the last like 6 hours. But they have a very good attitude about it, which is saying something. But and then this guy is showing a sea cucumber. He's one of the few people that have switched to a different type of livelihood. Instead of catching fish, he is catching sea cucumbers, and they're being exported to China because they're a delicacy there. And for now, that's doable. But again, this is now becoming an issue of overfishing the sea cucumbers. And then that has a cascading effect throughout the food chain and the ecosystem. But what choice does he have if this is going to be like the kind of catch that is available? Getting into small island nations, obviously they are much more heavily affected. They have a very small overall carbon footprint. Especially compared to larger Western nations. But despite their small carbon footprint, they experience outsized effects from climate change. So what they contribute to climate change, they feel like tenfold. So obviously flooding, erosion, loss of income affects them much, much more heavily than it affects other nations that are wealthier and larger. They have limited natural resources and their physical size. So as I said, having the adaptive capacity to switch livelihoods is very difficult because you can't really switch to farming. There's no land for farming. You can't really do logging because you don't have forests because it's an island. I mean, you might. That's what they're doing in Indonesia. but that also, of course, comes with a lot of its own problems. Exactly. And yeah, so there's limited options when you live on a small island. You know, they tend to be very densely populated. They have high coastal populations, which makes them very vulnerable to things like storm surge and sea level rise and erosion. And then, you know, high population density. So when, you know, they're running out of these ways, you know, their livelihoods with fisheries, it's going to affect a much larger percentage of people than it would, say, here in the States if we suddenly couldn't have tuna anymore. Their freshwater sources are much more vulnerable to salt water. You know, here we have something like the Great Lakes. Huge freshwater source, not really vulnerable to salt water. I mean, just maybe where the Suez Canal is or the Thingy Canal. You know, but otherwise, you're not going to have like saltwater intrusion throughout the Great Lakes. However, Biscayne Bay is a very good example because it used to be very brackish water, so lightly salted, lightly salty. But what's happened is that we've changed the outgoing sheet flow of fresh water into the bay. So that's the underground, basically, flow of water. And because that pressure of fresh water has reduced, the salt water has been able to come in quite a lot and create this huge saltwater wedge, which is basically, because salt water is heavier than fresh water, it creates a wedge underneath the fresh water. And Biscayne Bay has become much more marine than brackish now. And so that's the same sort of issue where you have a brackish or freshwater source that's very vulnerable to saltwater intrusion. And that's very true for small islands because of their proximity to saltwater. And then, of course, you know, a lot of these are developing countries. Their GDPs are very small, so their financial situations are much more kind of vulnerable. They have insufficient financial and technical capabilities a lot of times to mitigate the effects of climate change.
We're going to be a lot more concerned about that third thing because we don't drink salt water.
Yeah, that's a huge problem for us here. And you know, we've already, like, so we tap our fresh water out of the ground, and we've done that to such an extent that that's what's caused the problem in Biscayne Bay. There are all kinds of plans to sort of restore that, but you know, whether or not that's going to be possible and how well that'll work remains to be seen. And you know, the population of Florida continues to grow, so the demand on fresh water is going to grow with it. So when you're looking at small island nations, the IPCC and other countries refer to them as small island developing states, so SIDS. 30% of the people that live in these areas live at about 5 meters above sea level, which makes them extremely vulnerable to sea level rise and storm surge. I mentioned this earlier before the presentation started, but I believe it's something to 80 to 90% of small island nations exist within the tropics. And that's the area that is most heavily affected by sea level rise and storms and things like that. Some important facts to consider. 20 countries in the world are responsible for 75% of the greenhouse gas emissions. Predominantly Western countries. You also, of course, India and China are the two biggest ones. United States is third, go US. 60% of the countries with the highest losses due to climate change and natural disasters that are exacerbated by climate change are small island nations. So 75% of the greenhouse gases come from 20 countries, and then what did I say, 90% or something of small islands exist in the tropics, and of those, like, we have 60% of them are facing the highest losses and problems with climate change. Oh, there it is, 90% are in the tropics. I guess I got ahead of myself. And the IPCC has labeled small island nations as the nations that are most vulnerable to climate change. They don't have the financial resources, they don't have the land mass, they just don't have the adaptive capacity that other nations have to deal with it. And then on top of that, because of their size, they are affected very quickly and very heavily, whereas large nations aren't. At COP26, which is the most recent climate change meeting, global climate change meeting that happened, that was, I think, in October or November of last year, there was a group of small island nations. As I mentioned, they're called small island developing states. So if you read about this, they'll be referred to as SIDS. A group of them got together and they basically attempted to convince the more powerful nations like the US and the European Union that they need to sharply curb their emissions. Their emissions are affecting these countries. And there's nothing that these small countries can do about it. They're small. and they don't have the power, they don't have the financial assets. So it's really up to these other large countries to care and do something about it and understand that what they're doing is affecting these other people. And then they also did request that wealthier nations pay large sums to small island nations to help them mitigate, because they're like, you're causing the problem, you should pay for it. I think that's fair.
What happened?
The thing is, like, I feel like very little came out of COP26. There was a lot of talk, and that's how these things always go. There's a lot of talk. Sometimes things will eventually get done. The Paris Accord is good in that way, in that it has sort of provisions to make sure certain things get done, but it does still ultimately end up being voluntary to some degree. So
Aren't any names on the line written in?
theoretically, everybody's a part of the Paris Accord now, but again, it's still like the things that it sort of proclaims to do, it's very hard to enforce these things on an international level. There are provisions in the Paris Accord and some of the previous agreements, like the Kyoto Protocol and things like that, that are specifically there to provide aid to less developed countries. So that, of course, includes small island nations. Whether or not it's enough remains to be seen. Based on what happened at COP26, I'm sure that the small island nations are saying, no, it's not enough. They did, at COP26, pledge a lot more money towards climate mitigation, though, like a lot more than they had in the past. So it's a pledge, but it's something, at least, that could hopefully lead to something being done. And then there are a lot of nonprofits that work in resiliency and climate justice throughout all these other nations. When we worked in Grenada, when I was with the Nature Conservancy, we worked with them to do, like, there was mangrove outplanting to restore the mangroves that had been cut down or destroyed in some way. And then also, these are way better looking reefs than ours, but we were also doing artificial reefs to help recreate the breakwater from the reefs that were degraded. This is something that's going on all over the world. We do it even here in Florida. We're not always good at it. In the 70s, there was this push to dump all these old tires in the water. I'm sure you guys are aware of that. They're like, oh, it'll just grow coral and be a reef. And no, all it did was just leach chemicals and like kill everything. So they have now removed over 2 million tires. I think that's most of them. And really what it was just like, they were looking for an easy way to dump tires and came up with a stupid idea. And it didn't do anything, it just caused problems. It was a really bad idea. But there are other things that seem to work much better. Like these are some examples. We made sort of steel cages out of rebar in Grenada, something similar to rebar. Here in Florida, especially actually at Rasmus, University of Miami, there's Rescue a Reef, and they take trips out. It's a citizen science program, and they grow coral in their coral nurseries, and then they break off what they call fingerlings, which is just little pieces of coral, and then they go out to different areas and they outplant them. And then they monitor them for 5 years to see how they're growing. And then after 5 years, it's considered a wild colony at that point, and then they stop monitoring it. And they've outplanted something like, I think, 5,000 corals at this point. And what they're trying to do is reconnect all of the coral, the patch coral reefs that we have that go down the side of Florida, down into the Keys. That used to be one continuous coral reef, and now it's very patchy. And so they're trying to connect the patches with sort of like genetic bridges of coral. So that way you have more genetic flow of the spawn and stuff from the coral, and it makes them more resilient. And then, of course, Key Biscayne. Many of the same problems here. Sea level rise is a problem. We have a lot more flooding now than there was 30, 40 years ago. Increased storms, the 2020 Atlantic record that was just set, 2021 was almost a record. The more storms that are coming our way are only going to cause more damage and problems. Degrading reefs, that's not necessarily due to climate change. Some of it is, but obviously we have a lot of problems with pollution and water quality. But ultimately, a lot of this can directly or indirectly be related back to human activity and or climate change. And then, of course, there's more. I could keep going. But we are not a small island nation. We are part of a very wealthy country, and that works in our favor, theoretically. The idea is if we can make enough noise, if we can vote in the right people, be civically engaged with your community and with what's going on with the country, You know, if enough people can do that, then you can affect change and, you know, get people in place that can actually are willing to do something and willing to actually put policies in place that make a big difference. And ultimately, if enough of that happens throughout the world, especially in the more wealthy nations or the bigger polluting nations, then, you know, indirectly you are helping these small island nations that can't make these changes themselves. So, you know, they're pushing for they're advocating for themselves, but it helps if that also comes from other sources as well. And ultimately, you know, for a place like Key Biscayne, it's going to help us too, because we are a very small island and we are heavily affected by these same problems. And that's it. Are there any questions?
Well, that $100 million bond issue should help us out here, right, locally?
It should. That's the idea. So, yeah, it depends on how it's managed and what they do. But yeah, hopefully, I mean, that's exactly, yeah, that's the plan. And so, you know, I have high hopes for it.
We're moving toward the new ice age. What is there to worry about?
We're not anymore. That's the problem.
We're not moving to every ice age is preceded by warming of the.
No. It basically goes in ups and downs in temperature, and it was heading down, and now it's heading up. So it was heading down to enter an ice age that would have lasted, you know, 100,000 years or something. Nothing that would happen within our lifetime. It would stay very pleasant while we're still alive. I mean, it takes thousands and thousands of years to enter an ice age. That would have happened normally.
Put all the carbon dioxide
Yeah,
in the
and I only talked about carbon dioxide. There's a lot of different greenhouse gases that are even more powerful than carbon dioxide. That, yeah. Methane is 25 times more. Yeah, methane is 25 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. The reason people don't talk about it is because there's just a lot less of it. So the amount of carbon dioxide outweighs the effects of these other greenhouse gases because there's so much. But there are a lot of other ones. There are, what are they called? Not fluorocarbons, fluoro something, but
Air conditioner used to.
yeah, exactly. I can't remember what it's called, but some of those, yeah. But yeah, they can be thousands of times more powerful greenhouse gases than carbon dioxide. But the amount in the atmosphere is minuscule, but enough to be a problem for sure. But compared to the amount of carbon dioxide, that basically outweighs everything else. So that's why people talk about carbon or carbon dioxide all the time, because that's the biggest player. But there are a lot of other ones too. But yeah, and that's what I was showing the very, very first slide with that graph that shows the carbon dioxide content in the atmosphere. Yeah, and you can see going back like 200,000 years, I think. I don't remember how far back that graph went. It never got over 300 parts per million in the atmosphere, and now we're at over 400. So, and that's for the past 200,000 years.
There are things coming, do you hope, technology? In other words, I think Ireland has some process, they're pulling the carbon dioxide out of the air and using it. I mean, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, if you guys want to stay for another minute or so, I can show you a video about that, actually.
Yeah, please.
Pretty much, we've completely changed the course of the temperature on Earth. Extraordinarily unlikely that the next ice age will happen unless we actually make some real changes.
Can't have one unless we, the one in the regular cycle.
Carbon dioxide up into the atmosphere. Carbon withdrawal now has to be thought of as part of Plan A for responding to climate change. Here in British Columbia, we collect CO2 directly out of the atmosphere.
To some people, it seems like something that's way down the road, but the technology is ready for us to use now.
Climate change is a nasty thing, and it's going to take all of human ingenuity to get us through this moment. What we need to look at is if direct air capture is going to live up to its promise. It's much easier to keep a unit of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere than it is to try and retrieve it once it's already there. So when it comes to climate change, the best way to respond is to stop putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. In addition, scientists are suggesting the need to remove about 10 billion tons per year. That does have the ring of science fiction to it. Broadly speaking, there are two different categories of carbon removal strategies. One is a biological category, planting trees, changing farming practices, or you can have the other end of the spectrum, imagine more technological, chemical-based strategies. Something like direct air capture, which would have been off the table a few decades ago. It's kind of a wacky scheme by mad scientists, now needs real consideration. But the economics and storage questions about whether carbon dioxide can actually be held over the long term, these are open questions.
So we're a carbon capture company. We have a pilot facility which captures a ton of CO2 per day. We think we're different because we're focused on very large scale.
There's different ways of attacking carbon capture. What we do is direct air capture. So we're targeting the low concentration CO2 that's in the atmosphere.
Fundamentally, our process has 4 steps. Each step concentrates the CO2 more. First step is a big fan. It pulls air through, it reacts with a chemical, and captures 80% of the CO2 out of the air.
We take that CO2-rich solution, we precipitate out solid calcium carbonate pellets.
We heat those very small pellets up, and out comes the CO2. You can then do 2 things with them. You can choose to permanently bury it somewhere safely. Now you've reduced the overall level of CO2, and that's carbon negative. Or you can make products out of it. One of the things we do here in Squamish is we combine our CO2 with hydrogen, and we make a fuel that's essentially carbon neutral. You put it in your car, you drive your car burns the CO2, and it goes back into the atmosphere. And that's what carbon neutral means. You're not adding overall to the quantity of CO2 in the atmosphere.
If you think about a closed loop system, around and around we go, in time though, there won't be enough to address climate change because the carbon dioxide has to be put into storage to actually remove the carbon dioxide from the atmospheric system. Direct air capture at the moment is a reasonably expensive proposition.
Industries feel that at scale, costs come down all the time. That's why as a company we focus on large scale, and why we're also happy to license our technology to anybody in the world who wants to build these plants. We just announced our first large-scale plant in Texas. We're actually expecting that will be a 1 megaton atmospheric CO2 plant. That's the equivalent of 40 million trees in one plant. Our cost point is a little bit less than $200 per ton for that first plant, but we expect the cost to come down a lot.
If carbon dioxide can be captured for $150 or less per ton, then it becomes almost a commercially viable enterprise, because that carbon dioxide could be put to a use that would enable the facility to pay for itself. But to scale it up would mean building lots and lots of these facilities and spreading them around the world.
You could eliminate the world's emissions with 40,000 of our plants. Sounds like a big number, but it's actually less than our power plants, for example, in the world.
Lots of grand promises have been made about carbon removal, and one of the jobs that has to be done now is to sort through the reality from the promise. The goal is to use large-scale carbon removal as a piece of humanity's response. But if society kind of gets the notion that there's a get-out-of-jail-free cap, then that might have perverse impacts on climate response today. So the trick now is to work out what forms of carbon removal at what scales are going to make the best contribution and the most socially just contribution.
We think of ourselves as a really important tool that we have to have in the fight against climate change. I don't think it should be the only solution, but we need everything we can bring to the table.
Hey, thanks for watching. We've got more videos just like this one about people and ideas that are changing the world. So hit that subscribe button and you'll get all of our latest releases.
Are there any other questions or anything else that?
What's the name of that website again?
Oh, it was freethink.org. I teach an online climate change course at Denver University, so that's why I have all these videos handy. But yeah, and it's basically, you know, what I think is one of the most important things, which is just basic science knowledge behind climate change, because I think that's mostly what's lacking when it comes to people not understanding climate change or not believing climate change. You know, it's not because of any malicious reason necessarily. It's just that, you know, people don't really, and it can be very complicated and confusing. So, you know, it's kind of a way to sort of help people to understand, you know, what it's about, what's going on, and, you know, have kind of just a better grounding so they can talk about it better, or, you know, have a real conversation. So.
And know that someone's trying to do something about it.
Yeah, so there are currently about 21 carbon capture plants throughout the world right now.
How many?
21.
And we need 40,000, they said?
Yeah, we need a lot, a lot more than we have. No, I don't think it's 40,000, but we.
Let's do our U.S. share. That'd be.
Yeah, I think the majority of them are of the 21. The majority of them are in the U.S. or at least in North America. But yeah, the biggest problem is that they are prohibitively expensive to build. But as newer technology comes out, as it is, I think the price has dropped since they were first when they first started working on it, the price has dropped like nearly 70%. So you can imagine if it's still prohibitively expensive, how much it used to be, you know, to make one. But the price continues to drop as they come out with newer technologies, and you know, hopefully sometime in the future we get to a point where we can really make a serious impact in the atmosphere. And then, you know, there's a lot of other ways, even just individuals cutting down on their own, you know, carbon footprint, reducing their own carbon footprint. That really only works if everybody does it, but, you know, the more people you convince, the better. But then it does, you know, really ultimately come down to large companies, and they have to really, you know, make a huge change and impact themselves. You know, individuals can only do so much. Did you have a question?
Are there any of those plants in the U.S. or are they all?
Yeah, there's most of them are in the U.S. Yeah, there's Joan mentioned there's at least one in Ireland. This one was in Canada, and I don't remember.
They were just putting in Texas.
Yeah, they're doing one in Texas. There already are, and they're different types of carbon capture plants. They're not all like this one, but I think there are at least 10. Maybe 12 in the States. I don't remember the exact number.
We need to convince our big oil companies to do that.
Yeah. They actually do some carbon capture, because pumping carbon dioxide into an oil field before pumping out the oil is a way of, one, reusing carbon, but also increases their yield of oil. And that's been going on since exactly, and that's been going on since the 70s, and not for any environmental reasons, just because they realize that this helps their yield of oil. But now they bring that up as like, oh, look how green we are, we're reusing carbon. It's like, but yeah, exactly. But they can make a bigger impact than that if that's just one thing. But definitely, I mean, you know, they need to step it up for sure.
Well, look what happened to solar panels now. We put some on our house in right around 2000, and it really was expensive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and now they're ubiquitous.
Now.
Yeah, they're everywhere.
And what they did is they attacked not building the panels, but the installation,
Mm-hmm.
and cut down on the cost of the installation. So if they can find a chink
Yeah.
in that armor of building those plants, then
Absolutely.
do it a lot more.
Yeah, it's the equipment that captures carbon, because the one thing you have to keep in mind, despite how much carbon dioxide we talk about is in the atmosphere, it makes up less than, I think, 3% of what's in the atmosphere. It's 80% nitrogen, and then 20%, and these are rough numbers obviously, because that makes 100%, but it's mostly nitrogen, and then most of the rest is oxygen. And then carbon dioxide is just a minuscule amount, but it's such a powerful greenhouse gas that having that in the atmosphere is enough to cause a lot of warming. So when you're looking at these plants, they have to do an enormous amount of filtering the air to capture carbon out of it, and that's what makes it really expensive. So like improving those technologies to pull the carbon dioxide out is what's really key in making them less expensive. I think it's 19% is oxygen, and then within that last 1% is carbon dioxide and everything else. So yeah, it's
Well, you young people are going to have to do it, because we got us into the problem. The older
Oh, I know. Yeah, no, we have to fix it somehow.
A lot of it was we didn't know what we were doing, and that's true.
Yeah, no, definitely.
There
No, but the bigger problem is that once we knew what we were doing, people didn't want to change it.
That's right.
It's, you know, people are stubborn.
Never want to change.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. I don't want to change. Like, you know, I get stubborn. I turned 40 this week, and now I'm just like, I'm an old lady. I don't want to. Thank you. But yeah, no, I find myself like, I don't, you know, I'm super stubborn already. I don't want to change anything. But, you know, it is hard. And that's why, you know, the more people that do it, the better. But it's really hard to get that many people involved.
But you need to get started on just a little bit, and then you say, well, that wasn't so bad. And
Yeah, my sister came to visit me, and she was actually giving me grief because I wasn't recycling enough of my stuff. And I was just like, I'm the environmentalist. What are you talking about? Like, so, yeah. But she lives in Seattle, where they make it much easier to recycle there. So, you know, it's easy to get. Oh yeah, exactly. It's much easier there. They don't make it easy here at all. So it's very easy to become lazy about it because it's not, you know.
Although the composting here is beginning to grow, which is good.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Every week and putting it in the park there, and it's creating great soil.
Yeah, and the number of families involved is growing too.
120, so
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's getting there, but definitely.
there are a few more who probably are too that aren't in that program.
Oh yeah, there's probably some that do it.
If you are, then you can also.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for coming. I really appreciate it.